Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
Listeners, you might not have heard this, but we are writing a book. Very, very slowly. Painfully slowly.
Saying we're writing a book feels not quite right, but is technically true.
Yeah, it is true technically. We've written some words on a page. We have, I don't want to tell you how much we have done. That'd be too embarrassing. Anyways, we are writing a book, and to do that, we do need to do a considerable amount of homework. And homework is boring, and you have to do it at home. But lucky for you all, we record a podcast from our homes. So we're going to do some of our homework publicly on this podcast this time around. Right now, we're kind of working through this chapter about the idea of growth, and talking about growth in terms of, I think, like a religious perspective on it, for sure, a Christian perspective, if you will, but also talking about growth as like an ideology and like a fundamental thing to the way that capitalism works. So in this episode, we're going to talk about a really interesting book that's written by this guy named Fred Magdoff, who's an environmentalist, and also John Bellamy Foster. That's right, the notorious JBF himself. And the book is called What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism. And I think this book is great for a few different reasons. The reason I like it the most is that it's unlike a lot of other JBF books or books from the monthly review milieu. It's like approachable and written for a popular audience. And I think that is like a writing vibe I need to get into my life a bit more. And also it's just good at laying out some of the fundamental ideas. So this book is a bit dated. It's from 2011, but I think it has a lot of good stuff into it about how capitalism works and maybe from this like more environmentalist perspective. Very neat. Dean, what do you think in terms of introduction to this book?
Yeah, lots to say about it and growth in general, but it is a cool book that still holds up. Some fun monthly review trivia. Maybe Fred Magdoff is the son of a guy named Henry Magdoff, who people always talk about Brian and Sweezy as a pair, rightly so. But Henry Magdoff was a third guy in the mix and was really involved in articulating a theory of imperialism that is pretty interesting and cool. And pretty neat that his son is like carrying on the monthly review tradition, I guess. It's like the next generation of weird socialists writing books. And I think it's a cool book also because it's addressed to environmentalists, but trying to explain the economy in ways that don't assume that you're already an economist. So it kind of starts from the basic premise that you probably care about the world. You think that what we're doing to it is not good. You can kind of see the effects of the economy that we've built around you, but maybe you don't have the tools to fully get your head around like why exactly is it the way that it is. And I think it's a cool service, I guess, that the book provides to give some of that language to explain what's going on in a way that doesn't feel like, I don't know, written by like know-it-all socialists or kind of berating you for not knowing anything about economy, which I think some socialist literature reads that way. It's like everybody is a dummy until until you've read Karl Marx, and you probably already read Karl Marx. So like, here we go. This book's great because it's like it's a usable tool for activism and so on, and has a lot of great things to offer. And I think it's a good model for how socialists should write. I don't think our book will be as good as it, but we're going to try our best. We'll see how far we get. It's a great one, though. People should read it.
Yeah, I agree. It is a cool book. Once again, What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism by Fred Magdoff, the secret third person after Brian Sweezy, and then also John Bellamy Foster. Man, it is great, though. It is a book that you could definitely just like throw at somebody and they could read it, and it wouldn't be even that weird or that scary to read. So anyways, very accessible. I think I said this too. It's from 2011, so some of it is a bit dated, like in terms of, some numbers. There's a few like graphs and charts that are from 2008, which are definitely dated at this point. But anyways, we can bracket some of that and kind of take the big ideas from it. We're getting into it, though. I think growth is a super interesting idea within capitalism because it's a secret thing that is happening that everyone in capitalism is obsessed with. And people are always talking about growth, but you don't necessarily always know they're talking about growth. there's like all kinds of like weird coded ways that people talk about growth. Like, they'll talk about being job creators. That's talking about growth in a weird roundabout way. Or you'll hear people talking about the stock market. The S&P is up or down, or, the Dow or the NASDAQ or whatever. Those are also conversations that are like fundamentally about growth. Something else that I thought was actually really interesting too is that I just lived through my very first ever UK election, where people overwhelmingly, unfortunately, I guess, elected a very dumb Labour Party. But the Labour Party has been talking a lot about how they want to get Britain's economy growing again. And it's just like, wow, that's a phrase that really means nothing for anybody except rich people, I guess, really, right? So anyways, we got Keir Starmer, we got Rachel Reeves. They want to get the economy growing. We got people talking about being job creators. We got the invisible hand of the market going up or down in the stock market. But what does any of that mean? What's growth, and why do people care about it so much? I guess the big question. So, Dean, I'll throw it over to you.
Great.
Yeah, go ahead. What's growth, and can you just go ahead and explain it really quickly?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've talked about it a bit in the past in different occasions on the show, and we're going to talk about it some more. So if we don't figure it out now, we'll have other chances to do it. But we'll try our best. I think we'll do it. And just to add another layer to what you were just saying, I think it's actually really important to recognize that when we say what is growth, obviously we're going to try to parse it out in some technical ways, but it is helpful to sort of have like your ears attuned to where people are talking about growth all the time and kind of try to figure out what's behind it. Like, for example, even going into the US election, there's all kinds of talk about how Bidenomics is really killing it out there. The stock market is going gangbusters and so on, and a lot of Democrats are sort of citing that as like really good news about the economy, but a lot of people are not doing super well, or maybe don't feel like they're the beneficiaries of that
Right.
growth. So how that growth happens and for whom that growth happens or doesn't happen is a big piece of it. So here is how Foster and Magnificast explain capitalism first, which will kind of tie us into growth. They say, in the briefest possible terms, capitalism is an economic and social system in which the owners of capital appropriate the surplus product generated by the direct producers or workers, leading to the accumulation of capital by the owners. Production takes the material form of the production of commodities for a market with the aim of generating profit and promoting accumulation. Individuals in this system pursue their self-interest, checked only by their mutual competition and the impersonal forces of the market. We'll say more about it in a minute, but that's like a lot of jargon already to kind of parse out, and I promised it's an accessible book, and maybe this doesn't feel that way, but I swear it is. If you read the sentences very slowly and you parse them out with your great sentence diagram, you can definitely figure it out, but we're going to try to do it live here. The key here is that everything is organized in a capitalist economy around the accumulation of capital for owners of capital. Right. So if we think back to our basic Marxism 101, the way the economy is arranged is that capitalists, they get people to work for them. The people who do work for them are the people responsible for the growth. They produce the value and so on that happens. So if you're in a shoe factory and a bunch of people go to that shoe factory to work, eventually you have shoes that you can sell on a market, a commodity that you can sell. If all those people decide not to show up, then they don't make any shoes and nothing can be sold. Nothing happens to the material that the capitalist bought. So there's no value produced in the end. So the kind of paradox of capitalism for Marx is that you have these people, the capitalists, and they're the ones benefiting from the accumulation of capital. They're getting all the capital, but they're not actually the ones creating all of the value. That's the workers. So that's one big piece here. And so the goal for the capitalist is to keep getting bigger and bigger. And we'll explain why that is later on. There's some specific reasons. I mean, greed is part of it. It's not the only part of it. The other thing I think is really important about this little quote that I read, or little passage, is that they say production takes the material form of the production of commodities for a market with the aim of generating profit and promoting accumulation. That, I think, is a big piece here because production can take lots of different forms. It can take many material forms. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that it's that production is oriented around producing commodities, producing stuff that we sell. in order to kind of keep growing our profit, or for capitalists to keep growing their profit. So, for example, you could produce something with the goal of eating it, right? You could be a subsistence farmer. You can produce things with the goal of trading it. You can produce things with the goal of sharing it publicly, and so on. There are lots of different reasons to produce. In capitalism, our economy is motivated by trying to produce stuff you can sell, which increases profit. So you can kind of see how growth is so integral here, right? The capitalists are trying to grow their capital in a big way. And the whole process of production that we have is oriented not toward making stuff for everybody, but toward making stuff that can be sold in order to grow that capital. Does that seem like a good baseline, at least, Matt, from which we can kind of build the big building of this podcast episode?
Yeah, I think it makes that's a good place to start for sure. The other piece that we could probably add too is that this is a book that is fundamentally for people who are interested in like environmentalism,
right?
And the fundamental factor that production takes the material form of the production of commodities is also like, you know, important for people who care about the environment, because for something to take material form, it has to be produced from resources that have to be extracted, and also you know, it takes energy to produce the resources and to produce the commodity. So those are things that I think, you know, environmentalists will probably care about, and that's why there's sort of this like opening into the conversation of like Marxist economics and like what capitalism is for environmentalists in the first place, because like the simple fact that like that production, that growth has a material existence, I think is like of the utmost importance to people who are really, you know, interested in carbon emissions and climate change and things like that. I mean, consumption, right? These are all environmental questions as much as they are political economic ones.
Right. And not only the stuff that we do with everything, but also the waste that's produced, which is a really cool part of this chapter that we can talk about later. But yeah, we make stuff and we also waste stuff, and that is essential to growth as well. It's not just growth with no remainder.
John Bellamy Foster and Fred Magdoff, they use a handful of religious metaphors, idioms, illustrations throughout this chapter that I think are really interesting. Neither of these characters, JBF or Fred Magdoff, are particularly religious. An important side note, though, JBF, John Bellamy Foster, sorry. JBF is just like what I like to call him because I'm his best friend and we talk all the time and hang out and stuff. But he
Mark's
did write
Harry
one.
Potter.
Yeah, exactly. He does kind of have that Harry Potter vibe about him. He did write a book debunking intelligent design once, so there is sort of that that other side to his character, which that I've not read that book. I have no idea. I have no clue about any part of that book, but it is such a funny idea to have a very serious Marxist writer who writes about political economy and environmentalism writing about intelligent design. I'll have to get to that someday. Anyways,
I'm sure he's right.
I'm sure he's probably right about it. I don't know. Who can say? My hand was created intelligently, though, to hold a banana in a really particular way. So I don't know. Kirk Cameron told me that part, and I believe him a little bit. So anyways, they do use all these interesting religious metaphors and allusions, some of them that you'll find in Marx. And here's one of them. So in the paragraph that right after the one that Dean just read, they write, accumulate, accumulate. That is the Moses and the prophets. It is the mantra of the system as a whole for each individual capitalist. The logic of accumulation and competition drives bourgeois production out of its old course and compels capital to intensify the productive forces of labor. It gives capital no rest and continually whispers in its ears, go on, go on. The resulting juggernaut accepts no boundaries to its expansion, but continually tries to break them down, developing new technologies and expanding to new markets. We'll get to growth in a second, but before we get to growth in particular, we can talk about accumulation and exactly like how that is connected to the idea of growth. So in the Marxist paradigm of the political economy, right, you can't have, like, capitalism doesn't exist as sort of like a stable state in the world. And in fact, there would be a lot of problems with capitalism if it did. Instead, capitalism has to constantly be gaining more profit. Like, you know, think about what kind of weird capitalist you would be if you started off with $100, you invested that into the production of some commodities, and then you sold those commodities and created a profit, and that profit was exactly $100. Like, you would be a bad capitalist. There'd be no reason to do it if you're always breaking even. The point of capitalism is to make a return on your money, right? You want to invest $100 and you want to make $200 back or something. But that like fundamental assumption that you want to make money, which seems like kind of stupid to say out loud like that, but that fundamental assumption that you want to make money is the whole point of capitalism, right? I mean, they use they use the phrase the Moses and the prophets, right? It's like the driving force in sort of like a weird mystical kind of way. Why is that the way that it is? It just is that way. It just is that way. And in fact, if it wasn't that way, capitalism would be a wholly different beast. It would work differently, unlike it does now. So the orienting points here is that capitalism is a system where workers produce things, capitalists own the means of production, the things that workers produce are sold, and the profits are to be accumulated. And the thing that's interesting about growth is, I mean, the assumption that about growth I think is actually particularly odd, is that you need growth so that capitalism can, you need growth so that capitalists can take the money from the profits that they have, stolen from the workers, and they reinvest that, right? And the hope of all the workers and the hope of like other people in general is that like there's some mechanism that exists that will force capitalists to reinvest that money in the workforce and pay the workers like a higher wage or something. But, that's rarely what actually happens with growth. Maybe some of that will go to the workers and increase wages. Maybe if the workers have a particularly good union and they have like some good leverage, maybe that would happen. But, some of that money will probably go to reinvestment and maybe opening another factory and quote unquote creating more jobs. But we all kind of know the truth. It's going to go towards a second and third house for the capitalist who owns the means of production, Anyways, I guess I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but accumulation, it's like the bedrock of capitalism, and growth is sort of like what we do with that accumulation in capitalism.
Right. And I mean, even when you see reform moments within the history of capitalism, they're always trying to deal with exactly that problem. How do you sort of force a capitalist to either like reinvest in their own business, which is like maybe they'll provide them tax breaks or incentives or whatever, or how do you wrest the capital away from the capitalist so that you can choose as a government, let's say, to reinvest it, in whatever way that you want. So when you get to something like the New Deal in the United States, the big moment that social democrats love a little too much, if you ask me, the whole scheme is that could we, basically after like the Great Depression and when the market has shown that it doesn't, automatically lift all boats and so on, could we build a more stable system by essentially expropriating more wealth from the wealthy and reinvesting it in big public projects or whatever, or that's how you get things like public healthcare systems and so on. There's this kind of assumption that capitalists won't do it on their own, so you need a state to manage it. But historically, as who are we reading right now? As Foster and Magnificast say, the capitalism, it won't accept a boundary to its expansion. So you get something like the New Deal, and then by the time you get to the 80s, you have this kind of neoliberal move where capital sees all that as a huge set of borders and barriers, and it breaks those things down by eroding legislation and so on, right? And it plunges us into further financial crises. So it's kind of, there's something baked into the logic of capital that resists those kinds of barriers. And that sort of like religious element to it, you find it again appearing throughout the book in a few other ways that I think are really interesting, especially for listeners to this podcast. For example, they say also in the book, the essence of capitalism as described here can be captured by rewording the first commandment of the Bible as follows: "Thou shalt have no other gods before the accumulation of capital." Ecologist Richard Levins gives a concrete example of what this means. Agriculture is not about producing food, but about profit. Food is a side effect. Health service is a commodity, health a byproduct. Although markets existed long before capitalism, an economy organized entirely around the production of commodities for sale for profit in a market is unique to capitalism. So this kind of idolatrous nature of it, right? That you should have no other gods except or before the accumulation of capital. is a big thing. And I mean, that's the kind of thing you could read in a liberation theologian, as we've said on this podcast before. That's the commonality that brings liberation theologians and Marxists together, that the common enemy is a certain kind of idolatry. And what I really find fascinating about Marxists turning to that term is it does express this kind of weird imaginary drive or kind of imaginary pull that happens in capitalism, where because we sort of accept this premise or this maxim and we deify the principle of growth itself, it kind of like steals our attention. It orders our steps or our actions or behavior in ways that are, patterned to increase capital, in the same way that, like, a Christian might say, whatever, we go to church, we go to mass, we worship Jesus Christ, we read the Bible so that we can pattern our lives in a particular way, to have certain values instilled in us, to act in a certain way. And I think it's really instructive that Marxists, when they talk about accumulation, at least in this instance, kind of see that idolatrous nature as well, or they find that a useful rhetoric, a useful kind of language that appears over and over again in Marxism. There's a kind of weird godlike feature that we ascribe to the principle of growth, and, like many other gods, we're willing to sacrifice a lot of things to that particular god to make sure that it is, like, sated and growing, even if it's basically irrational. So a big common thread here is actually that kind of idolatrous nature of what's going on.
Yeah, I'm glad you said the word sacrifice, because I think that's actually a bigger feature in the story of capitalist growth than we come to recognize usually. This idea came up a few weeks ago when we were talking to Tad DeLay about his new book, Future of Denial. You can go back and listen to the episode, or you just go buy his book and you can learn about it there too. Tad's book wrestles with some more recent data and, perspectives on the idea of growth and climate change and capitalism. In the book, Tad ends up talking about the ways that, like, growth necessarily means more carbon emissions. There's no way around that, right? So if you want a growing economy, fundamentally what you want is more carbon in the atmosphere. Or, to some extent, like, even people who are environmentalists have to recognize that, like, even in a transition away from fossil fuels, that there still will be some carbon in the atmosphere. But anyways, all I'm trying to say here is, as long as we still exist within a capitalist system and the economy is growing, we are burning fossil fuels to do it, to create energy, to create resources, and so on, all to get there. And there's this other part in Tad's book that I think is kind of apt for this discussion. He's referencing somebody else, now I can't remember who off the top of my head. But he's talking about the ways that when we are continuing to burn fossil fuels in light of, all the things that we know about capitalism and the climate crisis, we're borrowing against the future. We're taking time away from future generations. And there's something like fundamentally really darkly sacrificial about that. Like, we're sacrificing the time and the quality of life of our future children and our children's children, so that we can have, one more Minions movie or something, which is dark. But that is, like, fundamentally, idolatrous, right? In the Christian way of thinking, you're sacrificing time, children, the livelihood of other people who you don't know, your neighbors, to a God who fundamentally does not care about you, and doesn't really exist in the first place, I guess. But it's all bad, is all I'm trying to say.
It's all bad, and we shouldn't do it. I agree. And yeah, I mean, the sacrifice bit, the waste part, is such an essential feature that people don't talk about a lot when we talk about capitalism, including when we think about growth. It's an old saying in socialist movements that in capitalism, we privatize gains and socialize losses. And that's a really standard kind of feature that you can see. I mean, anytime, like, somebody drives up the rent in your neighborhood and a cool coffee shop has to go away, speaking from personal experience right now about my favorite coffee shop, which is now leaving because of rents rising in my neighborhood. For years and years and years, the gains of that situation are going to a landlord or whomever else, right? Like, the gains kind of get funneled upward into increasingly smaller channels. The majority of the money is going to go up to the capitalist. That's the point of having a business, or exploiting a business, or whatever. And when that sort of space fails or that business venture fails or whatever, it's not as though the only person who's affected is the person who's been enjoying the cream of the crop. Instead, everybody else is expected to kind of metabolize that loss, whatever it might be. That is a huge problem when you have giant economic crises like the housing crisis in 2008, where for years you had all these bankers speculating on bad mortgages, and they're making, tons and tons and tons of money off of doing it. And when the market finally does crash, the people who suffer are not primarily bankers. In fact, no real justice was done in 2008, right? Nobody was like really significantly prosecuted for kind of creating the crisis and so on. But instead, tons and tons of people had to lose their homes or were plunged into debt or lost their retirement or whatever it might be. So when the capitalists win, it's only the capitalists who win. When the capitalists lose, then everybody loses. So that's the other piece of the idolatry here, I guess, is you feed the god, and the high priests of capital, I guess, they're the ones who are getting all the good stuff. But the moment something goes wrong, it's not just them who are in trouble.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, let's talk more about growth specifically. So the pivot towards growth in this book happens with a kind of lengthy citation from a different thing, but I think it works out, and it's actually quite interesting. And it does keep on going with this sort of religious imagery theme that we have going in this episode so far. So Magdoff and JBF, they write, "We are told all the time that only economic growth can make life better." So that's the assumption, is that, again, that capitalists will take the profits that they've stolen from workers. I'm going to keep using the word stolen, the evocative phrase stolen from workers, even though a capitalist would just see that as their rightful winnings or earnings or whatever. But the idea there is, again, that the capitalists, they will reinvest that money for the good of society. And it's weird how that never happens ever, even once. Kind of surprising. Okay. Anyways, so they go on to say, we're told all the time that only economic growth can make life better. But as Gus Speth tells us in the environmental journal Solutions, economic growth may be the world's secular religion, but for much of the world, it's a god that is failing, underperforming for most of the world's people and for those in affluent societies, now creating more problems than it's solving. The never-ending drive to grow the overall U.S. economy undermines communities and the environment. It fuels a ruthless international search for energy and other resources. It fails at generating the needed jobs, and it rests on a manufactured consumerism that's not meeting the deepest human needs. Americans are substituting growth and consumption for dealing with the real issues, for doing things that would truly make the country better off. Psychologists have pointed out, for example, that while economic output per person in the United States has risen sharply in decades, there's been no increase in satisfaction, and levels of distrust and depression have increased substantially. This is back over to JBF and Magdoff. The failing god of growth that Speth describes for the United States is nothing more than the way capitalism operates at its most basic level. No growth capitalism is an oxymoron. When accumulation ceases, the system is in a state of crisis, with considerable suffering for the working class. Capitalism's motive force is the competitive amassing of profits for new capital formation in order to generate more profits and more accumulation ad infinitum. So capitalism is a system that doesn't work in a sort of linear fashion, I think. And maybe that's a helpful way to start getting your mind around it. Capitalism is like a circuit that's constantly running. And the circuit is, you have some money. You're going to use that money to buy the necessary capital, by which I mean, a labor force and natural resources to create commodities. And then you're going to sell those commodities for more money than you've put into it. And then you're going to just keep doing that over and over again. And each time, you run that circuit, you'll make a little bit more in profit. And hopefully you can make that that whole process of, putting money in and getting money out more efficient, where you'll increase your profits every single time. And you can keep creating new factories and new ways to make money and so on. But that's all you're going to ever be doing. And it's never going to make any of the workers' lives better. It's not going to make the environment any better. You're just going to kind of keep putting more money in, a capitalist's pockets. And that's as far as you'll ever get. But that's growth, fundamentally.
Yeah, they our friends JBF and Magdoff, they appeal to a pretty classic Marxist formula to describe it, which I don't know if you're just getting into the book Capital or trying to figure that book out, you'll have seen this a million times, but it's great that they put it in this book so that people who haven't read that book can make sense of it. And the key is there's a difference between what you might call a CMC formula and an MC.
Oh man, here we go.
And I'll just say, I know, I'm gonna say it. It's worth it. It's a great thing that you can like write in your notebook and look like you know something about economics.
I'm gonna get an MCM tattoo on my arm.
That's all right. A great tattoo for having just the absolute weirdest conversation at a party by accident. So here's how they describe it, and we can break it apart a little more. They say nothing could be more opposed to capitalism as a system than the commonplace depiction of it in terms of a simple exchange process in which a commodity, C, is exchanged for money, M, to purchase another commodity, C, so that the process ends with a definite use value that is simply consumed, or CMC. This is similar to a barter system, C to C, but with money used as an intermediary instead of directly exchanging one product for another. In such an exchange process, there's a definite end with the consumption of the commodity, which becomes the whole object and consummation of the process. So again, this might seem jargony, but if you read it slowly, it will make sense. It's kind of like, it's a way that a lot of people understand capitalism. I don't think everybody does, but from a consumer perspective, it kind of seems to make intuitive sense, right? You have a commodity, so whatever you make, I don't know, like imagine you're in like not a factory setting, but like a small artisanal Bible manufacturing shop. You're a great Bible bookbinder. That's you, Matt. And Matt, you've made a great Bible, and you have decided that Bible's a commodity. You're going to sell it to somebody else. They give you $100 for your great Matt Bernica branded Bible. And with that money, you go use it to buy something that you want, which of course is not a Bible, but I don't know, food or something else, right? And this is kind of the assumption that we make about how capitalism operates. Somebody has a commodity, they exchange it for money, you use that money to exchange it for another commodity, and that's the great thing about money, is that it allows us to kind of convert our, objects as we desire, instead of, I don't know, lugging around a big boat or something. You can lug around your cash or credit card. So that's how we think of capitalism often. But it actually is not the kind of basis on which capitalism functions. So here's how JBF and Magdoff continue. They say, rather, the general formula of exchange under the capitalist system of production actually takes the more dynamic form of MCM prime. Prime is just like a little apostrophe by the M that signals that it's a different M than the first M. So the more dynamic form of MCM prime, in which money is used to purchase the inputs to produce a commodity, which is then sold for more money, or M prime. The object, in other words, is to end up with more money than one started with, that is, surplus value or profits. Such an exchange process has no end, but simply goes on and on without limit. This, in the next round of exchange, takes the form of M prime, C, M, prime, 2 primes, and so on, in an incessant drive to accumulation at ever higher levels. So, just to recap here, we often assume that capitalism is like, I'm making money so that I can buy the stuff that I want to buy. But instead, it's more the case that money is being invested to make commodities so that the person investing it can make even more money in a kind of bizarre, basically irrational cycle. The accumulation of money is done for its own sake rather than for, just the good of the commodity. The commodity could be anything. It doesn't have to be a great Bible, right? It can be, too many Minions, Funko Pops that you eventually throw in a desert or whatever. The point is not the commodity. The point is the money that you get from making the commodity. And that's a weird system, a weird way to build our whole society around the premise that we just have to keep growing that big line.
It's so fun when you start learning some of these like basic jargony terms and like, what does MCM prime mean or whatever. It's great because whenever you're at Thanksgiving and you're talking to your weird annoying conservative uncle and he says you should just learn basic economics, you can be like, well, let me tell you some basic economics.
Let me get your napkin.
Yeah, that's right. Let me tell you what Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes thought about the economy. This is what they had in common. Okay, so Good. This is good to know. And like Dean said, it is an irrational cycle. It goes on and for the sake of its own itself. It's self justifying. There's a lot of theological ideas bound up in the economy when you start really thinking about it, and it's unsettling. Okay, so say that you're doing this. You're going through this cycle. You're creating a lot of money. You're concentrating more and more capital. Because in this process, in this cycle, right? You're getting more capital from it. You're taking that capital and you're investing it in, things within the production process, right? More factories, more workers, so that you can create even more and more profits for yourself. You can squeeze out every little bit of surplus, from the whole system and put it right into your pockets so you can do, whatever it is that you want with it. Buy great artisanal Bibles, who could say? But when you do that and your whole sort of enterprise starts growing, you might have what is called a monopoly, where you're the only game in town for a particular type of product or whatever. So monopoly capitalism is a term that you've heard us talk about before, big time, when we've talked about Paul Brand and Paul Sweezy, the two Pauls, Paul squared, Paul and Paul Prime, if you will. The monopoly capitalism is like what they think, at least. This is like the sort of monthly review school of thought. But it's not beyond criticism, but I think it's on the right track to describing capitalism. Monopoly capitalism is where the competition between capitalists is actually more vibes based and made up than it is real competition. And that this is not just like, like a lot of people, capitalists will tell you that monopolies are bad, and that competition is good, and that monopolies are sort of like, breaking the rules of capitalism. It's the exception to the way that capitalism works. It's crony capitalism. It's whatever. Capitalists have all kinds of dumb bullshit ways of talking about like monopolies and why they're bad or why they don't really exist or whatever. But monopoly capitalism is like one of the types of fundamental features to how capitalism works in our current economic situation. And I said this book is a bit dated, and I think this part, though, is not dated. I think this is probably still true. Paul Brand and Paul Sweezy, they wrote about it in like the 60s and the 70s, and the Monthly Review folks talk about it quite a bit. And I think there's something to it. So this is what they write about monopoly capitalism. The trend toward ever greater concentration of capital is built into the whole process of capital accumulation. When a new product is first produced or a new industry arises, there may be many producers. But as the industry matures, a few firms come to dominate the market. In general, size wins out, with bigger capitals beating and absorbing smaller ones. Of course, there are always many small businesses, especially in local markets, restaurants, barbershops, plumbing, and electrical contractors, where a long-term niche is developed and the owners are content not to expand. Okay, so, there's a small coffee shop. It exists. That does not debunk the whole thesis, just to be clear. Small companies do provide employment, with some 13 million U.S. jobs in 2008 in firms with fewer than 10 employees. Very interesting. The small business sector, however, generally represents a low-profit, non-expansive part of the economy, which has relatively little impact on the economy as a whole and accounts for only a very small part of value added. Moreover, as the Center for Economic Policy and Research declared in its 2009 report, An International Comparison of Small Business Employment, by every measure of small business employment in the United States, has among the world's smallest small business sectors. So small businesses in the U.S. are especially small. The Center for Economic Policy and Research, CEPR, by the way, still does exist, and they have done follow-ups to this research that you can go look at if you want to, if 2008 is not your jam. Anyways, so the point here, though, is that, like, as a firm grows, it finds its niche and it becomes monopolistic. And basically what we're talking about here is not like, not your barbershop on the corner that is, one of a kind, less than 10 employees, et cetera, et cetera. We're talking about big firms like Walmart and Target. To say that Walmart and Target are competing with like the bodega or the corner shop that exists down the street is not true at all, right? To even say that like Walmart and Target are really competing amongst themselves is also not true. They're not really competing. They're sort of coexisting in the same niche, and they probably will, I don't know, for however long as they do. So I think that this is an important realization that there's not actually a lot of competition in capital, and we're talking about in terms of like scale here, right? Like, yeah, like I said, a corner shop is not in scale competing with Walmart or something. So they go on to say, though, that although corporations in mature capitalist economies dominated by oligopolies generally refrain from genuine price competition, which is frequently referred to pejoratively as price warfare, lowering prices is still used in some instances to gain or maintain a market share. But as the CEO of home products company Colgate-Palmolive said, pricing is often a non-sustainable answer. Continual competition by trying to undercut the competition is unsustainable. The recipe for most companies to bleed themselves to death. As two Harvard Business School teachers and a corporate consultant explained in the Wall Street Journal, competing by lowering prices definitely works for a few companies, but the reality is a very few. Think Walmart or Costco or Southwest Airlines. In fact, the very success of these business models makes it difficult for their competitors to duplicate. So think of Kmart or Sears, two companies that, if you're of a certain age, you'll never have even heard of before. Once these price cutters have gained sufficient market dominance, it's a good bet their price cutting will come to an end. So, the way that like Walmart, Costco, Dollar General, Target, whoever, the way they got there was like they were able to undercut their competition for a time. And then once they kind of fell into that niche, they stopped. They started raising their prices again. The point here is growth is fundamental to the way that capitalism works. Yes. But also like the growth of individual sort of capitalist entities like Walmart or Target or whatever, they also have a certain growth inherent in them. And out of that growth emerges monopoly, sort of like not the stagnation, but like the elimination of competition within capitalism. So the things that people think are really cool, sort of like big romantic ideas in capitalism about like competing against other people and like winning out, those are all made up ideas and they don't really happen. Like kind of like once you've reached a certain size, it's like you're not competing anymore. And if you're a small enough size, you're not really competing in the first place. You're just trying to like sort of survive in a local economy or something. So all that to say that like there's a macro and micro level to the way that growth works within capitalism, and then also the way that growth creates a type of like big gluttonous entity that can't really be defeated once it's created. So troubling ideas all around, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like maybe big economic jargon going on here, but I do think the more you can relate it to the trends that you see in your everyday life, the easier it is to get your head around it. For example, like here in Canada especially, but I know elsewhere too, there's a lot of talk about groceries and the big grocers and how they're squeezing everybody for cash, and they're doing everything they can. They're raising prices, they're doing shrinkflation, so they're giving you less food for the same price. The unit cost is going up. And the grocers say that that's just a natural knock-on effect of economic inflation across the board, but that is so obviously and demonstrably untrue, and not even Marxists have said so. Just regular journalists are constantly looking at the costs and margins and so on and reporting that it's out of control, and for no reason other than the grocers kind of are seizing a moment and trying to figure out how far can they push it. And it's another thing that Marxists have talked about a lot, what they call stagflation, where when an economy does start to stagnate or the growth slows across the board, it produces an inflationary effect, because how do you get growth in a company so that a company can stay viable? You have to pass that on to the people who are buying stuff. And of course, like you don't, the level of growth that a rich person is willing to tolerate is flexible. It's not like it's not like rich people are like required to make, millions and millions of dollars every single year in order to, I don't know, survive. They choose that, right? They are unwilling to make less than that. But there is a kind of drive to continue growing so that you can outcompete others, or just so that you can kind of maintain your hegemonic status. And it creates all these bizarre knock-on effects. The key is, again, that kind of idea that the gains are always privatized, but the losses are always socialized. They make a good point about this toward the end of the chapter that I'll read here. And then maybe we can talk about what we want to do instead of growth. They say, as shown by the Great Recession and its aftermath, they're talking about 2008, although you can kind of read a lot of this onto the COVID situation, although COVID has its own weird stuff going on. Anyway, as shown by the Great Recession and its aftermath, capital is generally not hurt as much in a downturn as workers are. Indeed, owners have ways of sticking workers with the costs of an economic crisis or stagnation. Today, the recession is technically over and profits soaring, yet the economy remains stagnant, with the masses of workers forced to make up for the relative losses associated with the slow growth of the system. In such circumstances, what economists call a zero-sum game applies, and profits come at the direct expense of wage income. Put simply, if the overall economic pie is not growing or it's growing very slowly, it's still possible for those with power to get much bigger slices, but only by dishing out diminished portions to everyone else. In general, they go on to say, environmental quality improves during recessions with fewer emissions from smokestacks and discharges into water, fewer miles driven by the public, and less natural resource mining. However, one of the ways in which the system tries to revitalize capital accumulation and growth under such conditions is by removing protections for the environment, which are considered an unaffordable luxury in hard economic times. Insofar as this helps the capitalist economy recover, however, it's often doubly destructive of the environment, since not only have environmental protections been relaxed to spur growth, but the expanding economy now draws on more energy and resources. So there's a compounding effect. And again, if it's bad for workers, it's not necessarily bad for capitalists, and that's kind of part of the game, right? The winners keep winning, losers stay losing. That's how capitalism operates. And just to kind of put a real-world example on this, I was just in my hometown in rural Michigan for the summer for part of it, and there is a big factory, an Abitibi factory. They make particle board and weird stuff, and famously, it makes our town smell extremely bad. And they were hit with lots and lots of lawsuits over the years about emissions and so on. And it was like common knowledge growing up that they would just always rather pay the fine than fix their factory, which is true. They would always pay these EPA fines and just kind of keep spewing a bunch of trash into the air. And they just finally went out of business because they lost another class action lawsuit, and they can't stay in business because they're now giving out millions of dollars as a result. And talking to residents in my town and family and so on is very wild because on the one hand, this huge pollution emitter is now out of business, and like that is very good for people's health. It is extremely bad. There are massive cancer rates in my hometown, and I guarantee they're part of that. But the crazy thing is there's all kinds of rhetoric also in my hometown about how it sucks that they're going out of business because now all these jobs are going to be lost, and where are people going to work? And some people have been trying to like advocate and lobby the city council and others to be like, we don't care if it's polluting. We need the jobs. We want the jobs. And man, what a like dystopian, idolatrous situation to be like, we would basically rather kill ourselves to make money for some other capitalist on the other side of this equation than, not be able to work in this particular factory, or not imagine attracting some other kind of job to this region of northern Michigan or whatever. So all that to say, the idea that the environment or people's health has to get sacrificed to kind of keep the economy growing, and that when something bad happens, all that is also kind of doubly forced back onto average working people, I think is a big thing that, it's one of those fundamental contradictions of capitalism that you can see if you stay in a community long enough or kind of track these issues throughout actual working class communities, especially.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's such a weird contradiction. Doing some of the homework for the book, again, that we're writing very slowly, I've been learning some things about what some weird medieval Christians have thought about money and capitalism and wealth, and I mean, not capitalism, but, markets and emerging trends that would become capitalism later. And the thing that kind of reoccurs quite often is the observation that, thinking about things through the frame of money, of markets, is fundamentally an alienating feature, because you always end up thinking about not like, even in the example that you just mentioned, Dean, the people in that town, in your hometown are not people. They are people who are going to work. They're workers primarily and they're consumers secondarily, right? So it's like it's alienating even in the first place just from that perspective, because like you're not thinking of them as people who have families, who have livelihoods, who have hobbies and people they love. They're just like people that have to work to keep the town afloat, and people who like consume to also keep the town afloat. So I don't know, looking for answers to contemporary capitalism in the weird thoughts of medieval saints is like probably a dead end. Sorry to say for our book. But there are some like, I think there are some really interesting ways that like only, reading something in that different context is just like, yeah, isn't that bad? Like whatever. The medieval saints that I'm reading about, they all thought that was like diabolical. That was literally demonic to think that way. And for us, that's like, it's Monday morning and we're going to work and like that's just the life that we live. But there is a real like moral quality to these things that we don't consider very often because it's like outside of our frame of reference as people who are living in and between capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that these saints and even a lot of biblical kind of principles like the Jubilee year and so on, one thing that they get right is that if you open the door to unbridled accumulation for its own sake, then it's pretty hard to like close that door again. The accumulation takes off. It takes hold of lots of things, and it has these knock-on effects. We've been reading and talking a lot about St. Francis, who famously hated money in some extremely funny ways. And you get the impression that Francis, he has a severe extremism, right? He's an ascetic. He thinks poverty is the ultimate virtue and so on. And I don't expect that we all would want to live in such a way. I definitely would not. But what Francis does get is that, the more you do kind of open yourself up to having stuff, the easier it becomes to kind of think about, what kind of stuff you don't have or what kind of stuff you want. And especially as you kind of think about the transition into a capitalist economy, which Francis was kind of living through in a very small way. You can see the writing on the wall that as soon as Europeans discover that you can make money by speculating or exploiting or stealing the labor of other people or forcing people to work for you for a wage and so on, it's pretty unlikely that people will suddenly kind of have a change of heart and just give up and be like, oh, that was a mistake. We should do something different. And since Magdoff and Foster tell us that you can't have a no-growth version of capitalism, it also kind of intuits that if we were to really value the kinds of messages that are coming through the lives of the saints and so on, you would have to imagine some kind of system that doesn't make growth in and of itself a value. It's not to say that all growth is also bad or not a good thing or something, but the sort of assumption that growth unto itself with zero kind of planning around it, zero values kind of deciding how that growth happens, where it happens, for whom it happens, and so on. That kind of situation is, as you said, Matt, a diabolical one, a kind of antichrist version of it, an idolatrous economy for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe a few bets to hedge and some provisions to make that this is, first of all, an extremely U.S.-centric critique, I think, about capitalism. Like,
or northern.
Yeah, that's probably a good point. Sure. Yeah. A global north critique, that growth is bad, because in the global south, growth might be very different. It might look differently. It means different things in different places. But I think also too, like the sort of like lack of planning around growth is like the thing that kind of kills me. That, like you said, not all growth is going to be bad. And in fact, if you were to plan particular parts of the economy to grow in ways that were sustainable and good for people's lives, like growth in areas around like healthcare or public transit or whatever, growing these sectors of the society that we live in, those could be good things. But like unbridled growth for more Funko Pops and more Minions movies and more Legos or whatever. Man, Legos are so cool though. I don't know. But still, you get what I mean. You get what I mean. Like just wasting so much of, like I said earlier, betting so much of our future away to things that are extremely superfluous seems like a bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think personally, I think the Funko Pop example is a good one, and I'm fine with it. But I think actually it can get us into a trap too of being like the fundamental onus is on consumers to figure it out. The big issue is like all these rich people, they extract so much profit, and what do they do with it? They literally like go to space with it. They build submarines that blow up in the water. They like poison a bunch of stuff so that they can have, I don't know, whatever. They like shoot lions on safari. They feed ducks till they can't eat food anymore, and they decide that that's what they want to eat. Like, you know, they invent these kind of insane ways to dispose of the income that they have taken from other people. And that's the problem in particular, that growth goes to no ultimate public end, no public good. You know, in a future society where growth is not the key, could we still have Legos and Minions? Like, maybe. Like, sure, we could have a Socialist Minions movie. I'd love it. I'd be a huge fan, and I'm here for it. I'll have a Socialist Funko Pop, whatever. I'll have these like great wooden Lincoln Log Legos. I don't know, but the key, I think, is that it's a basically irrational economy, that the things that drive what we make are making more profits, not making stuff that's good for everybody else.
Boom, roasted capitalism. That's it. You suck, you're irrational. Doesn't make any sense. Legos are still cool though, don't get us wrong. That's fine, but the rest of it is bad.
So thanks for listening to our homework. We're gonna have to do some more homework. This is kind of Matt and I's secret way of forcing ourselves to talk about the book and write it, so I guess everybody else is along for the ride. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see where it goes. But growth, it's still bad. That's one thing that you can rest assured. We've read even more books since we talked about it before, and we still think it's not good.
That's right. Well, we'll talk more about degrowth, I'm sure. But I think understanding the machinations of capitalism are pretty important for like diagnosing the society that we live in and really seeing exactly why this is a huge problem. But pretty good. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you support us on the Patreon, we are so grateful. One of the things that you get is a cool invite to our behind the paywall Discord chat where we talk about all kinds of things. Comic books. Which ones are good? Most of them, in fact. A lot of good comic books out there. And all kinds of other things too. Church stuff, pop culture stuff, just being friends, hanging out. The thing I like about the Discord is that it's like a community of people who kind of listen to the podcast together, and I think it ultimately ends up kind of informing the direction the podcast goes a lot of times too. So it's really neat. You can be a part of it. Our intro music is by Amari Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
Get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Decide what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was glowing in the lights of the downtown. Saw a spark in your eyes, I just spoke it. Said we're gonna turn this whole place upside down. Then you said, my dear, do you really mean this? I said, I only know what I feel right now. I said, poets lie, sometime come true. Stay awake with me, where see what we can do. Poets lie, sometime come true. Stay awake with me, where see what we can do in my town. I I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation, never get tired, never